I
Yeah, I did. Thank you for thinking of that.
Didn't expect that.
You did great.
Stephanie Sobitz to serve as this year's Colloquia committee. We wanted to bring in, oh, thank you so much, Noah. We wanted to bring in thinkers who are engaging with academia in ways that will enhance the work of the department, especially of our graduate students. And we curated a slate of speakers both for the fall as well as for the spring, who we thought our department could also support in their thinking. So we really want to encourage all of you to show up in all the ways that you exist into the space today and to also help Jared in his thinking during a robust Q&A session at the end that we're looking forward to. First, I'll go ahead and start by introducing Jared, who many of you already know. We're thrilled to be joined by him today for his talk titled "To Risk Imagination: Notes on a Palliative Theory for a Dying World," which reflects his recent conceptions of the labor philosophy and what it means to do rather than write about philosophy. Dr. Jared Groves spent his childhood in Texas, attended the University of Texas at Austin, and then after coaching college debate for half a decade, attended Johns Hopkins University as PhD in political science. Jared is a scholar in what he calls weird world of international relations and of political theories, whose first book centers on the ecologies and futures of global warfare. In this first book, titled Savage Ecology, Geopolitics at the End of the World, Jared outlines how global war enacts the geopolitics he defines as a form of life pursuing a savage ecology, which is radically combines foundational cosmology antagonistic to the survival of the collective human animal and non-human animal forms of life. In reviews of the book, his colleagues call him, and I quote, "a philosopher with a hammer, a writer with a stiletto, and an artist with a spray can." In addition to writing, Jared is an editor at Security Dialogue, runs the blog The Contemporary Tradition with Bill Connolly, serves as a reviewer for dozens of journals, and in 2020, he was nominated by students and received the university's Peter B. Garrett Distinguished Graduate Mentoring Award for his abiding support and mentorship of many graduate students, so many that I cannot give you the number of how many thesis and dissertation committees he serves on or chairs. And of course, as you all know, Jared also serves as the chair of our department and the director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jared.
Wow, that was an introduction. Thank you all, and thank you also for being a laboratory for some new ideas, which I've been working on. Give a little context, because normally I have like a laser light show that I learned going to Pink Floyd concerts. There are no pictures today. There are no GIFs. There are no weird glitching images. That I started to avoid other book projects.
We're gonna pause.
And then
You're muted. Yeah. So I'm just.
we did. Yeah, I got it. No. Yeah, I see you. Mute me. So the book project is sort of bigger than this talk for sure. It's to try to think about what would happen if we took international relations and global politics seriously as a chronic problem or a series of chronic problems rather than evental problems. That a certain kind of evental thinking is the reason why we always talk about the A-bomb going off and we never talk about how many times it was tested, went off, and got dumped in communities. The reason why we were fixated with COVID when we thought it was going to be like the outbreak. And then when we found out it was just going to debilitate 65 million people so far with long COVID, which dwarfs the numbers that have died. We don't have actually a way of talking about that kind of scale of disability, right? Because it raises questions of how are people going to work? How are people going to get care? And in particular, climate change, which we can talk about and generate a lot of affect for when it's going to end the species. But when it's going to flood Bangladesh, and when it's going to burn California and the Western Seaboard, when it's going to drive people over the Mexican border, we seemingly have no time for it, right? That the field of IR is sort of drunk on its evental sort of imagination of what is most important in defining the agenda. And so I'm trying to borrow from disability studies in particular, a notion of the chronic, which Jonathan Stern says it's all the things you wish you could cure but can't, that won't quite kill you. And that to me is a way of trying to think about these crises as something therefore also that are incurable. And rather than take that as a moment where we decide, well, if it's incurable, then we have to give up. Then instead, quite the opposite. If it's incurable, then we've got our work cut out for us. We have a tremendous amount to do, in the same way that we're all incurable. Right? We will all someday be disabled. And I think that is sort of the tone of the book. Mostly focuses on nuclear weapons, on climate change, on COVID, and the last chapter is on fascism. That we have an easy time thinking of fascism when it's smashing in windows and burning down the Reichstag, and it's the square in Nuremberg. But when it's the fact that even shaking Sunhouse's hand, the famous blues artist who was tracked down by Lomax to try to get a recording of what he actually sounded like. Lomax and Sunhouse were threatened to be executed because for a white man to shake a black man's hand was to give a black man the dignity of being a man. So we can't think about what W.E. Du Bois said was the experience of black Prometheus, to have one's liver devoured every day and begin again. The chronic nature of fascism eludes us when the catastrophic version of fascism fascinates us. So the book tries to think about that and then think in terms of what other ways of doing theory we could do. And in particular is inspired by this idea that Pierre Hadot has, that it actually takes a lot of work to distinguish between anxiety and lucid anticipation. Between anxiety and lucid anticipation. So this bit is toward the end, where I try to think about what that might look like, and hopefully get to the very end, where I try to think a theory of what I call palliative theory, alongside what my colleague Eoli Sorio is thinking in terms of Polina, and I think also Malama in terms of healing, and why they're not the same, actually, and what they could maybe I could learn from the other. So I'm going to do the thing that I never do, which is I'm actually going to read you a bit of paper and hope that you can follow along and it makes some sense. So theory is for the living. A theory of extinction is therefore a theory of anticipating extinction. We think the structure of its anticipation, not its event. If extinction cannot be itself thought as it destroys its own grounds for thinking, what value does thinking extinction have for philosophy? For me, extinction is always incomplete, multiple, and iterative. And so its anticipation is also incomplete, multiple, and iterative. For me, extinction is raises the question of a good death and a good life, as well as the problem of living in times that never quite live up to the event of the end, and instead find itself chronically going extinct, but never quite gone. Put it another way, a perpetual leaving afflicts our present planetary fracas. There's nothing like a dialogue or global community for whom to take up this condition. What makes the din of complaint and anxiety planetary is its hallucinatory ambit, not its universality. We're not afflicted equally. Nor are we constituted by our difference, a multitude of singularities. Our ability to feel or be affected by change happening in so many places and even so many times speaks to the power of imagination. Our hallucination is not simulacra or deceptions, it is real. What makes it hallucinatory is that it is made, stitched together from so many different kinds of extended and present sensations. The miasma of planetary affects cross species, geographies, substances, temporalities. For all of my baked in misanthropy, and I have plenty, particularly for the hubris of scientific reason, I'm in awe of the models and oceans of data that make the atmospheric concentration of carbon something we can feel, at least something that can be felt by those of us that can still feel anything at all. The paranoia that our hyper-mediated environment is numbing our capacities to access the world are well-founded but incomplete. The frenetic twitch of social media platforms is only one rhythm of captivity. There are captivations and amplified capacities of experience enabled by our attempts to capture and explain the world that go far beyond this. Borrowing from Anne de Mortel's antinomy between the secret and science, something which she tries to resurrect as a way out of this sort of predicament. She says, what she calls science's evangelical drive to convert mysteries to problems has unanticipated consequences. It doesn't always go exactly as science had planned. For those of us primed for anticipation and even fabulation, new legibilities intensify our worldly encounters rather than framing them. Every line drawn is a horizon for curiosity, wonder, anxiety, rather than a boundary of demarcation. We look above the line, not below it. What can yet be seen, what recedes, is like what can't yet be thought, a lure for speculation, as we feel our bodies tingle with expectations for something unexpected. How many of us breathe cephalopods when before we could only wonder whether they tasted better with a squeeze of lemon or a dollop of aioli? Tears for an LA County cougar, not one on the Real Housewives, find their place amongst many that might have before never noticed or even outright cheered the murder of a competing predator. The imagination can be a realm of expanding relations rather than a figment of internal distraction. What and whom we imagine with, and even who we are imagined by, changes the contours of our extinction. I want to think this imagination of dying against the post-structuralist fascination with the solitary and singular moment of death. Anyone who lived through the 90s remembers there was like a million different versions of the instant of my death, the event of my death, the impossibility of my death, the singularity of my death, all written by someone named Bachelard, Bataille, this post-structuralist fascination with the solitary and singular moment of death is a problem, right? It leaves instead the concern of theirs obscures the crowded possibilities of dying. A moment like an event is too punctuated, too discrete for living as becoming. Dying too is a becoming, a living. Whether we do it alone or with new unforeseen but not felt togethers is for me the terrain of palliative theory. Gentleness rather than liberation, caring rather than explaining, feeling rather than describing. A lonely extinction is a failure of imagination rather than a failure of politics. What may distinguish, I think, this kind of Levinasian imperative of uncovering others, which you see in people like Butler's Politics of Agreeability, from what I have in mind is a common ontology of the other as occluded. I don't think the other is occluded. There is a sense in both thinkers of a veil to be lifted. A realer reel of pain is waiting behind a meniscus of narcissisms or representational practices. Falsehood in the way of the truth of pain and otherness. I'm drawn instead to those strange Wittgensteinians searching well beyond the Tractatus for the notes and scraps on the problem of pain. Little doodles that Wittgenstein had, mostly about someone going to the dentist, crying out because they poked them in the tooth. So the dentist had to decide, faking it, was it real? I'm drawn instead to those because of what they call the private language problem suggests that the ethical labor of meaningful and inspiring relations is not discovered, but made, fabricated, invented. The stories we tell each other and ourselves are conjurings, not representations. The imaginations we imagine are imagined by, call to presence, what wasn't there before. What can be felt could not be felt before because it did not exist before our conjuring. The feeling is the making. To be felt is to be made. The private language problem, like many Wittgensteinian preoccupations, is misleading, in part because what it often communicates is that language is the protagonist in our philosophical heist film. Instead, though, the private language problem is the problem of everything else other than language. It is the problem of language's insufficiency and the intuition of some that this is the case. After the collateral damage of cynical condolences and prepaid apology templates, which we've seen from everyone from Harvey Weinstein to the president of our own university, there is a kind of equal and opposite skepticism towards empathy, and it's well founded. To feel someone else's pain is often the prelude to nothing good. Or to be more specific, to share that you are moved by a pain not your own, or not of your pre-approved territory of relations, is an act of hostility. It is both true that such declarations of co-feeling are a trap, and that what possibilities of dying together are entirely dependent on the resources available for communities of co-feeling. This is where we are. Distinguishing between the cunning of sympathy and the risk of empathy cannot be a search for the fake. Sympathy and empathy are both fabricated. The veracity of their respective feelings, like the gasp of pain, is not available for Blade Runner's Voight-Kampf test. That's where they test the replicants to see if they really feel the loss of their mother. They never ask if they had good mothers. The other's feeling of the other's pain is as inaccessible to final verification as the pain itself. Therefore, the capacity of care to share in the vulnerability of each other's pain is a problem of trust, not a problem of transparency. To return to de Mortel, we are in a realm of the secret. Revealing does not tell the truth of the secret, it defers it. Cavell called this problem the problem of skepticism. Steve Mortel writes about the sort of paranoid drive for the conventional subject as seemingly fueling this skepticism. Subjects of apparent truth, she calls us. This kind of habitual sharing, which is actually not real sharing, renders all of ourselves a surface to be shared, liked, or commented on. It's not honest. It is a false grounding that will never satisfy a deficit of trust. Saying and feeling are incommensurate currencies. The ethical question is on whom the labor of trust falls. Certainly, betrayal is unequally shared, and yet trust cannot be made alone. For trust to be earned, the work can be taken up first by those that have benefited from mistrust, but there is a limit to what that work can accomplish. Being a candidate for trust cannot be verified like a credit score. Neither can categorical forms of thinking succeed at sorting those that can and cannot be trusted. Such forms of division are productive in the sense that they make and reproduce worlds and relations, but they make and reproduce relations antithetical to the possibility of sharing our extinction. Some teetering balance must be struck between each and every singular relation of feeling to trust and being trusted, for the conjuring power of imagination to do its work. What J.L. Austin called the felicity of language has a correlate for the imagination, something akin to Whitehead's notion of satisfaction, a feeling that one's intuition was on course, even if it never arrived at its destination. Such a risky and dangerous undertaking can only be an ethics and not a morality, and an experimental one at that. The realm of trust and imagination is too dangerous in a world also populated by sadists. What I'm describing is a possibility, not a duty. Imagining and feeling, intensifying one's ability to be affected is a gamble those unwilling to accept the lonely and indifferent coordinates of contemporary knowledge. This is an invitation to those who hear in contemporary calls to save the world, a fatalism more depressing than the end of the world. The imagination I'm cruising for is not the inch-deep waters of liberal allyship, too often filled with the cowards, as James Baldwin called them, or friends like these, as he also called them. To be lovers of, and in this world, requires skin in the game, a down payment not all of us have made. To hear Baldwin more clearly than I can formulate my thinking, to quote, the people that think themselves as white have a choice of becoming human or irrelevant. Becoming human is a very different kind of labor from becoming or being human. One is an inheritance stolen, the other a world invented. In this context of this adventure, to cling to whiteness is to seal one's pact to die alone together, or more often to kill together alone, as whiteness is kind of predatory and territorial monogamy. Whiteness is a form of life made again and again, primarily a parasitic dependence on the deprivation of others rather than any given content of its own. It is not quite right or useful to call whiteness a choice, but it is a desolation of its own making. Autopoiesis of the worst kind, doomed to repeat unless interrupted by other attractions and possibilities. Despite my intellectual debt to people like Noel Ignatieff, whiteness is not something to be abolished or even betrayed. In the end times, which is all the times, whiteness must be abandoned for something else altogether as yet unknown. To flee whiteness for the generosity and refuge of those too generous to seek their birthright of revenge may offer something more and less than the promise of critique. Less than the dynamite we seek to bring down the whole house of cards, but more than the waiting game for a blank slate to start again. For now, I will call this experiment palliative theory. Palliative theory is here imagined as a fragile reckoning for those with no time left to lose and the desire to make a form of life prospectively worthy of breathing before it is gone. If such an enterprise appears useless or downright offensive in the face of planetary urgency to ensure survival, my only appeal is for you to ask yourself without guile or hubris, for whom are you trying to ensure the future? What of this world are you so desperately trying to save? For me, this most obvious question feels the furthest from the clamor over our increasing sense that an end is very fucking nigh. Section 2. Between the chronic and the terminal, there is always plain old death. Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5 reminds us of the ultimate reprise to political victory and defeat, that there is always plain old death. That this is obvious is, I believe, more a testament to knowledge than wisdom. That is following Pierre Hadot's effort to think philosophy as a form of life, that knowledge commands you to know, whereas wisdom commands you to be. And to be differently. Our knowledge of near-death life avoids the certainty of the system. What the psychoanalytic types would call a disavowal by avowal is unavoidable in the panicked moral commands on the behalf of future generations. While I'm not quite able to find home in Lee Edelman's antinatalist disidentification with reductive futurism, I am moved to believe that the face of so-called future children is a wraith and not a child at all. The imaginative deficit responsible for the discrete and impoverished range of who and what we can feel is evidence contrary to any substance behind the rhetorical insistence to owe those not yet or maybe never to exist at all, so-called future generations. The claimed virtual children are not offered an inheritance earned, but one ransacked and stolen from a present never fully available to be heard on its own behalf. Like animals bred in mass only to be slaughtered, future children subsist on a debt that the borrowers never intended to pay forward. The moral financialization of the future, like derivatives and other anonymized and traded debt bundles, devour time and ship ephemeral value. What is left for those that may or may not arrive to be chosen children of a future foretold is more debt, for which other people's collateral will again be called to extend, again to another generation bred to fulfill the promise of human survival, but only of particular humans. Like theory, the future is for the living, not those not yet born. But rarely is a future for all the living, rather it depends on those expendable and useful lives. To quote Baldwin again, while white men, take on the heavy burden of ruling the world. Such a stark division of labor fills me with horror. What white men will do in the name of averting extinction has at its disposal the full depravity of what has brought us to this point to begin with. I don't have a plan or even a clear evacuation route to evade the cold distance of sympathy or the trespass of empathy. And yet I'm sure that the pain of others moves me, even if it is merely my experience of their expression of pain that drives that movement. To have only an expressive point of contact raises the question of what other grounds of relation are possible. To risk an argument that can't be won, confidence about who can and can't share pain may not derive from some fundamental connection or kinship, but from the trust one has in the delicate proximity to certain others' feelings on which kinship and connection actually themselves depend. I don't mean for this line of questioning to undermine the animating desire for identity politics at all, but ask whether identification itself may be a predecessor and an obstacle to the kind of imagination Baldwin and those like Jose Munoz seek. How to make of a line a horizon and not a barbed wire fence seems to me a philosophical pursuit worthy of what Godot calls a blameless life, and what I would like to reimagine as a blameless dying. That is a way of dying that would seek the relief and respite of those stuck between the chronic and terminal conditions of planetary extinction. Section 3, singularity, self-determination. When Baldwin declares oppressed and oppressor, white and black, bound together with the same society, dependent on the same reality, I don't believe he means that we share the same world, much less the same imagination. To live under the eyes of a God, as Baldwin writes, that made you but did not make you in his image is an ontological level of gaslighting. To borrow from Rudy Rucker, reality is a consensus reality. What we learn from Baldwin is that reality is a lopsided consensus, what Rancière called police order. What distributes the sensible, the legible, are the legend, myth, coercion of white supremacy. It is not the order, but an order bound by a blood oath, willing and tacitly conjoined, that many of us did not agree to. Many of us live on the wrong side of a real conspiracy theory, strutting as confidently through the White House as the hooded knights of Southern Shadowlands. Baldwin's concurrence with a hallucinatory, that is imagined reality rather than one equally available to all, comes in the final pages of an essay he wrote called Everybody's Protest Novel. Great essay, I think everybody should read it. It's about Uncle Tom's Cabin and also about Native Son. Rather than a reference to the self-evident and barren vision of moral polemics, good guys and bad guys, inverted, but still good guys and bad guys, the warped sensory train of America is, according to Baldwin, not a story of good and evil, but one as ambiguous as the tableau of Kafka. Baldwin's America is the nightmare of living in someone else's imagination. The rules of one's persecution, even one's own name, up for revision and recategorization by anyone but yourself. Therefore, Baldwin's battle for humanity, paralleled with Vigor Thomas's own literary journey, is a struggle to imagine oneself rather than having to squat in the imagination of those whose craven fantasies make of you a human thing. Baldwin refuses to make recourse to some more universal humanism in an effort to restore that thing to person. As Baldwin remarks about what he calls devotion to humanity of many liberals, such false idols are too easily equated with a devotion to a cause. And causes, as we know, are notoriously bloodthirsty, according to Baldwin. Counterposed to flaccid noise of the easy critiques and position-taking of a protest novel, Baldwin writes, the business of the novelist, that I want to read as the form of life of the philosopher, is to find the web of ambiguity, paradox, the hunger, danger, and darkness, to find at once ourselves and the power that will free us from ourselves. The power of the novelist is the power of imagination, what Deleuze saw in Cinema 1 and 2 as the powers of the false, a capacity to find belief in this world rather than finding relief in a resentment fixated on another world. Scoffing at those that indulge the necessity, according to Baldwin, to find a lie more palatable than the truth. Baldwin finds succor in self-determination rather than escapism or moral position taking. Self-determination, though, is different from what passes as freedom in our white libertarian pornoscape of sovereign citizens and men's rights victim narratives. Baldwin seeks a community, not an autonomy, where one's singularity, that ambiguity and complexity of life, can be on its own terms. That one's categorization alone be that which is real and which cannot be transcended. Baldwin proposes this task of accepting, not battling for one's singularity, is both harder and more necessary. Baldwin's formulation of the task of the novelist is paralleled by the task of what Hadot calls ascesis in the Greek tradition, or care, what I'm trying to think is palliative theory, eschews critique in the burden to declare or confess one's partisanship for liberation, for a more existential task and risk of being with and becoming with, according to Baldwin, the beauty, dread, and power of life, rather than rejecting it. Implicitly in Baldwin, and I hope explicitly for forays into palliative theory, is the inability of such labor to be accepted or accomplished alone. Rather than judge palliative thinking as succeeding or failing, I would rather find a space for judgment that affirms its endeavors about who and what kinds of persons can bear the world together, rather than what new whiz-bang revolution futures are promised for the introductory price of my extorted hope. Any palliative thinking worthy of the name could fail together with as much satisfaction as it could succeed. Like the chronic and terminal conditions palliative theory seeks to find a home in, our efforts, even if they are successful, will be at best intermittent, fleeting, and sometimes disappointing. But this is not easy. Letting people in our own categorization is also allowing secrets to belong at times only to themselves. Accountability and responsibility are not the same thing as transparency. We can make demands and support demands on one another without stripping each other of an imagination of oneself for oneself. That is the capacity to become otherwise than that imagined by others. Here lies the danger and the work of palliative theory. To become more than a salve and much less than a revolution, or maybe to be more and less than both. To be here and now without accepting the dictates of what the here and now mean. To believe in this world by imagining it in ways that resonate with our imaginations of each other's pain. A pain we cannot feel as our own pain, but which we imagine feeling, neither theft nor distance. Pain like singularity must be allowed to be and be bared together. Section 4, on spiritual exercises, the therapeutic versus the palliative. I'm almost done. Pierre Hadot poses philosophy as a practice further as a form of life rather than as an enterprise of exegesis. We're not here to describe. For Hadot, what marked the major schools of post-Platonic thought, Stoicism and Epicureanism, was a commitment to a philosophical life as primary to the being in love with wisdom. Reading, study, dialogue, writing, meditation, thinking were proposed as habits of a philosophical life rather than ends in themselves, much less a profession. Politics, finance, too much attention to things beyond one's control were seen as obstacles to a philosophical life. Hadot contrasts the philosophical form of life from the asceticism of Christian monastic life, to which many often try to compare it, to make two critical arguments pertinent to our concern. First, unlike the modus operandi of the Christian withdrawal from everyday desires, humdrum expectations of human life, there's no promise of deliverance, much less the expectation of eternal life offered by philosophy. Both Stoicism and Epicureanism pursue the befuddling calm of Socrates when awoken by his friends the night before his execution. For those not hip to the scene, Socrates' friends arrive at the cell anxious to aid his escape. They're dismayed to find him sleeping. When asked how he could sleep at a time like this, Socrates explains that he loves to dream, and if he only has one night left, he would not wish to spend it any other way. The friends are angered that Socrates seems so lackadaisical about his terminating sentence. There's a sense of betrayal amongst his friends because they've risked their lives to try to save his own. Socrates waves them off and asks to return to sleep. He wishes to sleep to dream for the joy of it. And this parable certainly ransacked for the gospel of Christ. Socrates expresses indifference for the legal and political order because it offers him no enjoyment, not because order, redemption, etc. offers him escape. Dreams for Socrates have no eternal significance, no ultimate meaning, just the possibility of encountering wonder. For Hadot, the philosophical form of life is a devotion to a capacity or structure of being not structured by the fear of death. Although the Christian devotion, as characterized by poverty, prayer, piety, celibacy, are sold as only being for the glorification of God, they are in exchange extorted with the flames of hell. The practices are not measures of their own, rather they are a means to a promised end, everlasting life. The figure of death is disavowed through its abolition, and therefore the fear of death is not relieved, but actually amplified by the eternity of the afterlife. One deprives oneself now to avoid the deprivation of eternity. The Socratic scene represents instead what Hadot refers to as the philosophical endeavor to become eternal by transcending yourself. Rather than transcend the world or death, what Stoicism and Epicureanism share is a cosmology in which joy comes from merely existing. What is transcended is a number of obstacles to that joy, in particular the fear of death, but also will to power given over to a will to control. While a certain resonance with Buddhism and even Taoism, in their efforts to sort of annihilate the ego are present here, there is also here a difference. The Hellenistic will to overcome the fear of death does not require the elimination of desire or connection to the world. Quite the opposite. The aspiration of these schools of thought is the capacity to experience the pleasure of existence rather than the freedom of nothingness. Side by side, there is a touch of Christian protection racket even in the appeal of Buddhism. Even if doctrinally prohibited by Buddhism, one cannot help but suspect that release from the wheel of life, i.e. the repetition of pain and suffering, is the ultimate breakdown of the fact-debt value distinction by mind. To observe that life is suffering and that the ego is the anchor to that wheel cannot help but motivate those seeking enlightenment. Even the Guardian says this is why there should be no Buddhist priests. The idea that you came back to free people means you're not free. Again, the ascetic ideal returns as an economy of desire, even not as explicit dogma. Deprivation now in exchange for less deprivation in the future. This world for the next world, even if the next world is presented as no world. For the Hellenistic schools, neither the world nor death are an illusion. The world, existence, is a source of joy, although a finite source. What undermines our capacity to experience this abundance is anxiety. Anxiety over death, the anxiety over what must be changed, what must be accumulated, what must not be lost once accumulated. Again, resonant with Christian dictums to avoid worldly possessions, but the valuation is actually inside out. Christians are told that possessions are worthless because they will not survive to the next world. The Hellenist schools argue that objects are mistaken as value and are a source of anxiety in this world. Things fall apart and we resent it. Struggling to avoid this fact only brings frustration. Given the cosmology of finitude or imminent eternity, the practice of Stoicism and Epicureanism and its philosophy are not cumulative in the way that Christianity and Buddhism seek escape, nor how contemporary scholarship, even philosophical scholarship, attempts to accumulate knowledge for future progress, called logical positivism. Philosophy as a form of life is meant to matter in its doing rather than as a resource for something else. For this reason, Hadot characterizes Hellenistic philosophy as therapeutic. Philosophy heals through techniques to prepare oneself to be changed by wisdom. The self is a mode of reasoning, and the appeal to the self is the seat of reason, rather than the topology of an exterior God or obscured by nothingness, is the second distinctive characteristic of Hellenistic thought. Following Hadot, that is significant for our experience. Unlike the sensuous insistence on the here and now, which I unequivocally affirm, the self for me is more problematic for two reasons. I want to explore at length. First, I'm interested in what collectivities and assemblies may offer other platforms of feeling, thinking, and imagining, particularly when confronting the anxiety native to our prospects of collective death and extinction. Second, as explained by Hadot, the self is an interior distinct from the uncontrollable natural world, chaos, according to the Greeks, forms the architecture of their spiritual practices. The self is privileged as having justification and efficacy over the self, its emotions, desires, passions. Through the capacity to form new habits, thesis, the one does not have over the natural world, what Machiavelli later revives as the realm of fortuna. I'm sympathetic to humility towards the natural world, but I'm hostile to its bifurcation from the self. To find the fulcrum of ascesis between the self and the world also cuts us off from natured nature and naturing nature, of which the self is simultaneously both. I want to consider what Catherine Malibu calls plasticity, the strange capacity of some assemblages to be formable and formative, as a condition of possibility for ascesis, but also a capacity that cannot be contained by a substance or a single form, i.e. a self, but a capacity that comes from the torsion between many different and differentiating forms, peoples, living things, places, mountains, rivers, oceans, outer space. A processual account of ascesis that more carefully attends the material complexity of plasticity, too quickly black boxed as a self, could redirect our attention to relations beyond what we take for granted as ourself. Philosophy then, I think, becomes a less lonely enterprise. If we can extend the humility towards the external world to the world of the self, which is of course always already the natural world too, then maybe we can temper the desire for mastery and the humanism, which sees the joy of existence as primarily the joy of human reason. Correspondingly, relaxing these divisions leads me to a more modest vision of ethics, where then freedom from anxiety or transcendence, both of which rely a bit too much on extirpating death from life, what if we could cultivate a more sensuous generosity for dying? Dying as opposed to death is of this world and does not happen alone. Dying, like the post-structuralist fascination with the instant of one's death, is profoundly shared, even when it is shared as absence, as in the case of those that are abandoned. No one dies alone, because there is no one, or there is no self that is alone. Whom and what we die with and experience dying with ought not be swept under the rug of the instant of death. If palliative care is as a practice rather than a theory is to be truly instructive, we must pay close attention to how much dying resists a particular instant or threshold. Like the process theories that enliven my thinking, dying bears witness to nearly limitless elongations and contractions of space-time. Therefore, the instant eludes us not because of its singularity, but because of its fiction. When we and how we decide to engage our dying and the dying of others, then, is not a material fact, but a consideration of the imagination, a puzzle for those drawn to pursue an ethical form of life. It is for all of these reasons that I see a valuable conceptual difference between the therapeutic and the palliative, particularly in an epoch in which extinction feels chronic and confrontationally collective. Conclusion, or Black Epicureanism, Baldwin reprised. I'm not primarily interested in Baldwin as a Black thinker, but as a philosopher of Blackness. I think he takes up these different intellectual personae, but I do not think they are the same maneuvers of thought. The line between narrating the experience of being Black, where he's often ghettoized, and considering the metaphysics of a world in which Blackness can exist, certainly bleeds in both directions, yet there is a distinction that makes a difference. As I tried to adapt from Baldwin's critique of political novels, there's a difference between the truth of art, philosophy, and the necessity of politics. Rather than attempt to contrive some moral difference between the two, I want to identify a palliative difference based on differing economies of value and satisfaction, as well as different ecologies of relations. The eye of the needle is threading the pluralization of the dialogue without losing the secret of one's singularity. Think about an ethics of plasticity in the shadow of extinction. To change and be changed has to teeter between an oblivion of self and a refrain of singularity that can, in Hadot's words, let ourselves be changed. To go too far in either direction, the chaos or the control, is to lose the friction or the incipience that makes dialogue intimate and invasive. What Carl Deutsch described as the fragile connection he called integrity. A necessary third term in the dyad between power as will and plasticity, the capacity to be formed. We are to consider learning something other than coercion or self-revelation. Hadot refers to this process as training. To devote philosophy to dying rather than revolution or liberation or progress, it's not a form of quietism or nihilistic indifference. Instead, of palliative philosophy is one committed to the daily labor of attending to the chronic character of pain and loss. What distinguishes this labor from other labors is its less glamorous and immediate availability to our efforts. There is no critical moment, event, paradox, crisis, or even apocalypse to wait for, as the need for our intervention is already here, and involvement matters, even though it does not make any difference at all. Relief, company, a touch, a song hummed, a warm place to dream one's last time. It is all fleeting and impossible to measure after it's gone. The time of philosophy, like the time of extinction, has no after, no future, no use, and yet is the time of gentleness, kindness, and care. I'll leave it there. So. Press down on.
Thank you. I was wondering, speaking of feeling, imagination, plasticity, how Malibu, she talks through this idea of plasticity through Alzheimer's patients or schizophrenia. Wonder if you think about the phantom or the magic or the unbodied voice or in these ideas of how you're describing feeling in the beginning.
Yeah, I hate to read more. I'm going to read this little paragraph. Response to and I skipped it. I shouldn't have skipped it. As difficult as preparing for our own death is, it is equally difficult at building the endurance to assist so many others with their untimely death. I see this practice different than the concerns of grievability or bearing witness, all of which concern the dead rather than the injured or dying. As Stephen Dixon's troubling novel, I reminds us, the dying are hard, they're scared, they're exhausted, they're ill-tempered, they're even at times dangerous. Time of dying also inspires in us anxiety, ambivalence, disgust, the whole gambit of what the guy calls ugly feelings. So I do also want to be attentive to the fact that, you know, I mean, having had lots of family members that fit every one of those categories you just described, it's a lot of work because you have to hold on to the capacity to give care to those people who can no longer return it in time. Actually, at times to people who outright threaten it. And in ways in which sometimes you have to imagine on their behalf. And that's where things get really dangerous. I think that's why I can't prescribe palliative theory as a track. Like if you just do this, everything will work out fine. You know, I think about like having had multiple family members with Alzheimer's, my dad with dementia. There was a moment where I had to make the decision to kill my father. That's what it is. Like I had to sign the form that said take him off life support. You know, he was dying, but he wasn't dead. And I had to imagine a version of him that could be in that conversation with that decision that wasn't the body of him that was there. And I had to look for those pieces, right? That's also like the most dangerous possible moment in the medico-juridical world that we live in, right? He was declared not to have the capability of making that decision because they diagnosed him with schizophrenia. Probably some other brain disorder. That was the easiest one. And yet I still had a duty to decide whether or not he wanted to be in the kind of pain. And so I don't think there's, I think one way is to think about it is this kind of haunting, right? A kind of ghostly appearance. But I also think we can't delude ourselves into thinking that we can conjure those too easily, right? Because we're also put in this incredible position of power that we like to tell ourselves the story of which that person for which we make these decisions for incarcerating them in some ways, for some people who are hurting others around them, not providing life-sustaining care, removing their capability to injure themselves, right? I don't think we can too quickly rush to they would have wanted this, right? And so we have to kind of hold on to those two things simultaneously. And I think that's, you know, I mean, to be fair, like that's also a global predicament, right? When I want to tarry with future generations, yeah, I think of course future generations, if they could be here, would say, well, please save this planet. And then at the same time, I think if you showed them what we were going to do it, they might not want to. I just read this great article, which I should have sent around. I was going to read it myself, but I went on too long already. About the recent investigation into cryogenics, which is part of another paper, which is called Live Forever or Die Trying. And it's about all these futurists who had their bodies and their heads frozen in the 1960s and 70s. The article starts with, you really haven't seen the horror of the future until you scrape the liquid goo from the bottom of the jar of a human vessel. And that's because, of course, keeping a person frozen, as many of you know, because you all shop at Costco, is a bit of a coin flip, right? Like, you know, that thing holds on for a while, but then it goes south real fast. And what was amazing about the article, and the article talked about, is that like people keep doing this. Like people are paying better money because they keep offering better freezers, right? Less frostbite. And so then it goes into describing that, you know, some of them sort of burst from the outside, but some of them burst from the inside. And I think about like confronting those people, like if we literally could bring their head back, Futurama style, and be like, are you happy that you are this goo? Like, did you want to be this goo? And did you want us to spend literally millions of dollars, right? Which could have been spent on, I don't know, feeding people, keeping them warm for the night, throwing the world's greatest party, so that your goo could get scraped out of the bottom of the can. And I think like, I know that's like that's a Titanic's worth of metaphor, but there are times in which I feel like, you know, the new green revolution or the new we'll save ourselves by going to Mars or the new don't worry, we can become robots that live forever, you know, like it's goo time will come. And I guess I think there's something really tragic about a form of thought that sees that as progress and then sees wanting to hold someone's hand while they die as nihilism. Right? Even if the hand we're holding is the whole. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, it's terrifically innovative work of thinking, Jairus, and what I'm thinking about as a result is that there are two things you're doing. On the one hand, you're retemporalizing the life world. On the other hand, you're also retemporalizing theory. So it's an encounter of temporalities, which means, among other things, that you have to be very attentive to the grammar in both. Does that help characterize it?
Yeah, I mean, I want to add ing to almost everything, right? I want things to be verbs.
Yeah.
And the problem with verbs is that without direct objects, verbs are supposed to be meaningless, right? They have to do something to something. And I guess I want to think about processual as being an end in itself. There were several years ago, I secretly founded a reading group, which became less than secret, for the study of useless theory. That's what we called ourselves. And the reason why was that we were so tired of being told, well, that's really important, but how does it like save the world? Or what does it do to, you know, end capitalism? Or not as if these weren't worthy pursuits, but the idea that thought and its boundaries of thinking, right, the process of thinking should already know in advance its object. Seems to me the death of thought, right? It seems by definition to reduce thinking to merely a procedure. And to already know the grounds of judgment for its success and failure. And what I like about the Hellenistic tradition, and I hope to be able to say at the end of the book, after much talking with my colleagues, about a certain Hawaiian tradition of Polina that is both in a place, in a here and now, but also not confined to a particular temporality, is that one should not have to make that choice. Right? That there should be a way in which one can be fully committed to the care of a place and a people and animals and oceans that is not judged by how effective that care will be. And so I'm trying to find these resources for it. I really love the way Hadot talks about philosophy because Hadot's terror of philosophy is that philosophers have destroyed it precisely by making it this grammatical thing where philosophy is, in some sense, the review of philosophy. Right? Nobody makes movies anymore. You just write better and better reviews. And that actually misses the fact that philosophy's job was actually not to produce more philosophy. It was a form of life, and a form of life which he reminds us was like open to all genders, adamantly opposed to the state, did not, you know, want to become involved in the economy any more than they had to, and universally thought of as freaks by everybody else. Right, to be a philosopher was not to be grand and have elbow patches. It was to be willing to live a life that was not at the cost of someone or something else. Even if that life was starvation in a bath, you know, or how it's retold. I prefer Coetzee version of it, which is Life and Times of Michael Kay. So, you know, I think, yeah, I struggle with the grammar because that grammar it's a grammar of doing. But it's all, I agree, it's also a grammar of taking place, like where the time of things are. And the part I haven't figured out the grammar for is that I want the present to not be restricted to a very Western conception of the present as presence. But I want those ghosts, those like ancestors, those future possibilities to be able to impinge upon the present. But I also don't want the alibi of history or the alibi of the future to become the grounds for what I think of as a kind of debt economy. where we make choices which we would never make in the face of someone we love, because we think we can pay that immoral act off later through the massive change that it will invoke. Or I mean, I think about even this talk that happened this morning, where a committed arms control activist is now the head of the State Department Division of Arms Control, and she said something like, "Yeah, I support disarmament, but I can't make that argument anymore around the people I'm in and in the neighborhood we now all live in, because China is too scary." But I believe that if I can manage this well, the bomb doesn't go off, we'll get to a place where disarmament is possible. And I think she absolutely believes that, and I think she lives a blameless life in the sense of her intent. But at the same time, that kind of mortgaging of the present on the future, it is a kind of economy. Right. And ironically, it is parallel to exactly the kind of capitalist economy that we now have, where everything is about like a concept you sold or a debt you financialized into the future. And I think like those chickens come home to roost for sure, but also like what a horrible way to live. As somebody who has like mountains of student debt, there's nothing worse than getting up every morning and thinking, I'll never pay this off. How do I keep paying this off? Once I pay this off, won't things be wonderful? Right? All three at the same time, It's like the new version of that pot was just fine when I lent it to you. I never lent you that pot. It was broken when I gave it to you. Right. But now it's, I'm making great money now with my promotion. I pay all my money into my debt. That's okay, because if I pay off all my debt, then I'll generate profit, and profit will allow for somebody else not to be in debt. Right? Those things are contradictions, right? And we live in that kind of mortgaged future. And I think we live in that as much ethically as we do financially.
You make mention of gentleness, which
Yeah.
I assume is from Dufour-Mantel's book.
Also from Plotinus, actually, but yeah.
How would you situate that or hold that in tension with the violence of the violence that people encounter in their day-to-day living, whether it's violence being done to them or them doing violence in order to live?
Yeah. I mean, this is actually kind of the centrality of that book, but this is Diff Mortel's question. And it's why she distinguishes it from care, which I have to do later in the book a bit. For her, gentleness is something given almost like grace, meaning it's that little bit of kindness one doesn't deserve, that one would still rather be in a world where it is given. And this gets back to the question of, sometimes the really hard people we have to die with. And the reason why I sometimes think that gentleness, and particularly anonymous gentleness, is a vital labor different from care, right? Meaning there are times when the biggest badass in the world is the palliative care nurse who agrees to hold the hand of or be with the person for whom another person can't bear to be there because of the injury that person might do to them. And how we want to create economies of gentleness for those for whom we ought not have a morality or obligation to provide care. Right? Not everyone should have to care for their abusive parents. We'll stop. And yet we don't want to give over to the sense of revenge and resentment that believes it would be better that that person died badly. So gentleness is a kind of middle concept that's about how do we provide respite, relief for a body in pain, even if that body has done very little to deserve it. And so it's not in spite of violence, it's actually because of it. It's because we live in these situations where even the most horrible person in the world, right, we want not to suffer. And if we can think about that in a way that's not part of a moral economy where pain is something we trade instead of justice. And I think this is like the heart of abolitionism. Then we care about gentleness even when we can't care to care. And that's why that labor, I think, has to be practiced, right? That takes endurance. To be the palliative care nurse or the caregiver for the person you didn't grow up with, who you don't know, and actually have a certain kind of distance from them while giving gentleness, right? And then to be proximate to that kind of death and dying and suffering and pain, right? Like there's sort of like, if there were like one expert skill set that I think will get us through the extinction of the world. I think it's much more palliative nurses than it is climate scientists or doctors, right? Because they're experts in what you do when there isn't a cure. They're experts in what you do when there's not a way out. And they're experts in what you do when nobody else wants to do it. And I feel like that for me looks like the agenda for ethics right now in a way that's very important. Yeah. Haley and then,
I want to offer something that's less of a question, just because it might be
yeah,
useful. Because you brought up abolition, right? So one of the things that Mary Pablo has said on multiple occasions, and written is she actually talks about our misuse of the language around accountability.
Yeah.
Like you can't hold that guy who's done that horrible thing to someone else accountable. You don't know him. You don't have a relation with him, yada, yada, yada. And always pushing against the kind of boundary of even those of us who call ourselves abolitionists and interested in transformative justice, like there's still this thirst for punishment, even if we're not talking about prisons, that you want to punish, not to hold accountable. And I'm thinking about that in relationship to what you're saying and your interest in Elima and transparency. And the way that this, in my mind, as I'm hearing you talk, is opening up a different kind of kuleana for those outside of the web.
Yeah.
Right. So the nurse had the kuleana not because of her position, right? Because we don't want to just describe kuleana to people because of the job that they have, right? But the anonymous care, the anonymous gentleness comes from someone specifically outside of the upena, because the person in the upena, right? Because we fucked them. Right, whether it's mental health or drugs or colonialism or just ending violence. So I think there's something really interesting there in what you're doing, that it's almost like an anti-Latina, right? A theory around the beyond.
it's trespass.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I want imagination to do. So that's why I want to explore particularly the way that you're thinking about it more. Because I don't want either or, I want both. Because
They have to coexist with
yeah,
each other,
yeah.
right? Otherwise, it's just a bunch of random people.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, which is the reason why I hate universal conceptions of humanitarianism, where we're just supposed to equally be caring of everyone, because that never happens. But at the same time, if we don't cultivate a little bit of the labors of imagination to put ourselves in a place we don't belong, then I think we also don't have something for those who've lost their relations. And not everybody loses their relations because they were bad people.
Right.
Some people lose their relations because they've been abandoned, because they've been excluded, marginalized, cut off. You know, and so, you know, like I wait till I have to give this, I'm gonna give this talk at the apps next year. And I'm sure someone's gonna be like, you mean like the veil of ignorance? And I'll be like, no, but at the same time, a little bit, yes, in the sense that, but not as an axiom, right? So how do we hold a little bit of this position where we want an expertise, right? A facility for gentleness for those we don't know, but also caring, loving, intimacy at the same, right? Like how, and I don't like the words balance or harmony or any of those words. I just think it's like all the jack of all trades things we're asked to do all the time anyway. I just think it's one of those other skills we're going to have. And, you know, and again, I think the other part of it for me, which I think gets lost in the veil of ignorance, is the veil of ignorance is always one person standing behind this veil that's supposed to not imagine who they are anymore. And I want collectivities, you know, because like we're already collectivities. We're always already collectivities. And so then, you know, I don't know. So I'm trying to walk this line between, like the first reading I had when I finished the book was I was like, okay, well, what if we do assemblages and therefore like Kevin Bacon, you know, like I just have to get there like through enough different relations, right? And then that becomes the way. And then I was like, no, I don't want to do that, right? Like the whole point is I want to have the relations and the non-relation at the same time. And it's partly because of a scholar named Nick Brady. He's a Afro-pessimist scholar at Buckeye State School. No, one of the little ones that's not Oberlin. I'll remember to say. You know, one of the things that he said is that like for him, anti-blackness is the ontology of non-relations, right? So much of what you have to deal with is the fact that your relations are denied, right? Removed from you, lied to you, right? And I think that's part of Baldwin's point too, is that like you can't. He was very skeptical of restoring blackness to some pre-moment. In that way, he was very much like Ellison's sort of shadow and act and going to the territories. He was trying to think about the fact that like you're black, you're never all black, and you're on somebody else's land for which you were dragged to. And you have two choices, right? You can either say, oh, well, we can restore Africanness, or you can like take that as a starting point for intimacy and love, which will also be the starting point for violence. And I guess, so I want to really hold on hard to relations and non-relations being vital together, even if they seemingly seem like a contradiction. So yeah, that's awesome. Okay. Yeah.
I think ask about something that you started with.
Yeah.
Right in the beginning.
Yeah.
So wanting to get away from this whole catastrophic language. Right? And then you started to use the word chronic, endemic.
Yeah.
So did you use? So the thing is that you have thought about endemic.
Yeah.
Marx and Engels say endemic crisis, right? These commercial crises.
Yeah.
I want to understand how are you using or how are you thinking about if you are thinking about endemic crisis, you do that work.
Yeah.
Because crisis. So this is what happens. You say crisis, prescribed crisis, claim crisis, in a redefinition of adaptive. Right?
Yeah.
So then why is that like in your sort of division of philosophy being performed like rather than knowledge and sort of meta reviewing and so on?
Yeah.
So I'm like thinking about that. And why crisis register not
Endemic.
not about knowledge.
Yeah. Oh, I see.
Yeah. And why is it about being and vision?
Well, there's two things, which I also take from Jonathan Stern, who's a disability scholar, which I think is really important. Stern, I was reading his book actually while I was getting my thyroid poke, thinking I had cancer, had thyroid cancer and lost his voice. He's a scholar of media. It's his job to go around and give talks. And now he can only give talks by vibrating his vocal cords and amplifying. And so he turned to disability studies. And one of the things that was really a struggle for him is that disability studies, because it has to fight the normative violence of the able body, at times can't express the pain and suffering of disability, right? Every disability has to become almost an identity, a way to be claimed in a kind of positive way. And so there's this like hard position between the two. And one of the things he says is that actually his disability is very different. He has to grieve his voice in a way that his wife, who was born with diabetes, doesn't grieve pancreas, right? It's never been part of her life. And so I don't want to just dismiss, I don't want to just get into the knowledge production of crises. Like I also want to think about the real pain and violence that the crises name. And I want to kind of hold those in tension. But the reason why I use the chronic, and I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, is I've come up with all these things, apart from reading this book from the 70s, that I was trying to look up, because since I got long COVID, my ability to instantaneously recall authors is like shot, particularly if I'm in the middle of doing something. But this was a book in the 1970s written by two feminists, one of whom wrote Nickel and Dime, so Barbara Ehrenreich, and I've forgotten who the other one was. And it was about chronic illnesses that were just would not be accepted as medical proof, almost entirely for women. Right? It's an amazing book, and I don't know why people don't read it anymore in disability studies, but they basically wrote it about all the different conditions which women suffer, for which doctors treat as if it were histrionic, right? Or hysterical. And that's actually one of the things I think is necessary about thinking about conditions or these things as chronic as opposed to as crises, is because the chronic actually has a real archive. The chronic is almost always about gaslighting, telling people, I don't think you really feel that. The climate change hasn't actually happened right now. This flood is just normal floods because you all are floody people. And it's not climate floods, so we're just gonna let this one happen. It's always related to expertise. right? So chronic conditions, the experts get to decide which ones count and which ones don't. The problem they have is they're never rhythmic, nor are they predictable. Their meter is variable. And so they lend themselves often to like disappointment. Like you show up at the doctor and you're like, this weird thing is happening. They're like, well, is it happening right now? Is the bunny in the room with you right now? And you're like, no, but like last week I was in excruciating pain. And so there is a whole language of sort of critiquing crisis, right? There's a whole literature of it. The problem I have with it, and I think this is less true of Berlant, although I think Berlant does a little bit in the fat chapter, is that like, and this is Stern's point, sometimes you want to get better. You don't want to just pretend like it isn't really a crisis. Like sometimes you don't want to be in so much pain. In The Terrible We, Cameron Hu makes this point about transgender, but like to be transgender is to like, you know, say what Stryker had to say, which is I'm not sick. That's what Susan Stryker said at a first gender conference when she declared herself to be a feminist and not somebody who was suffering from a condition. And whose point is like, we absolutely had to say that, but like dysphoria is real, right? Like looking in the mirror and not feeling like yourself is real. Feeling like crap after tweaking your hormones is real. Like feeling the pain of not like being recognized by others in the way that you recognize yourself is real. And so like we have to be careful where our critique of pathologization becomes a sort of evacuation of our capacity to experience real crisis, because the world is really fucking ending. Like, you know what I mean? Like things are falling apart. It's all falling apart. But it's not falling apart the way that we're being told that it is. In fact, quite the opposite. It never quite lives up to the thing where we're like, oh, well, if that happened, we'd break the glass, right? I recently heard that in a meeting. We don't worry, we do or don't have break glass plans. And I think the chronic character of many of these crises, right? The chronic character of racism, right? The chronic character of settler colonialism, the chronic character of water pollution, the chronic character, right? They always sort of like are beyond being livable and yet never quite living up to the emergency that supposedly they're going to be. And so, yeah, so I'm trying to think in that space, but I think it's different than the politics of knowledge over what is a crisis. It's different than the sort of like how Schumpeter reworks Marx, or how Marx, I think in Engels, even think about crisis, or Guattari even in Anti-Oedipus, think about crisis as this kind of like endemic form of capitalism reinventing itself. This is the fact that like we literally, like we have crises, but they're distributed in weird, unusual ways. Sorry, Krishna, and then.
Well, two thinkers who obviously work in parallel areas and we're very familiar with both, but one would be Rob Nixon and Flo Wilder.
Yeah.
On the disability stuff who are and the domain. So how do you locate your work in relation to those?
So I engaged War a lot in both the nuclear weapons chapter and the fascism chapter, because I think her distinction between disability and debility is really important. In the kind of conclusion chapter, one of the things I say though is that sometimes it doesn't matter, because sometimes at the end of the day you're just beat up and bruised, and whether or not it's because you fell down a lot or somebody pushed you down a lot doesn't change the fact that the intellectual and critical payoff of finding the distinction is not as significant as being able to care for somebody in pain. And so one of the things that I want to think about is like, what is critique supposed to do? And so I think for Pawar, what critique is supposed to do is to elucidate these power politics and the ways in which they come to define which bodies get in and out. And I think that's really important. But what it doesn't do is give us a way to care for those bodies, right? That's not considered an intellectual task. And I don't think that's just a leap of omission. I don't think she just didn't do that. I think it's because, and Hadot points to this, and I talk about this later in the book, Hadot makes the point that like, if you're in academic circles, if you say the word spiritual, you're out of luck. And his point is like, well, that's because you think spiritual in terms of self-help, you think spiritual in terms of Christianity, you think spiritual in these ways bifurcated from daily life, but like in philosophy, and I don't know, every other cosmology that isn't the West, spirituality is like literally what you do when you get up in the morning. You know, like it's the way in which you make meaning out of the fact that you have to greet the day and everybody in it in a particular way. But we don't think about that often as real scholarship. right? We sort of dismiss it as like self-help, self-care. Even when we talk about self-care, we almost always only talk about the fact that we're not allowed to talk about self-care. And that critical move is really important because once we realize that we can't talk about self-care, maybe self-care will happen. And Hadot's point is actually, these things are hard work. You can't just talk about how you ought to do them. You can't just talk about why it would be better if that were the mode of critique. You actually have to do them. The cool part though is that sometimes philosophy is the doing, right? Sometimes the thinking, if you're thinking with people, if you're thinking through the problem, right? That can be that thing if you're attentive to the way in which that thinking with builds those relations, right? Makes it possible to make that world. And so I don't think that Puar is not doing that. But it just means that like when we cite Puar, what we're really doing is we're like, oh, cool, I really want to write this essay on what drones do. And this is a really neat way of showing with facility the criticality of not seeing violence. In the Rob Nixon case, again, that's how the book ends, is with slow violence. It doesn't end with much else. It's a great book. I think it's an important term too. I think it's I'm a little bit of a bigger fan of Pavanelli's version of it, which in her book on Zones of Abandonment, she calls it the cruddiness, right, for the evitlessness of settler colonial time. Because what slow violence does is it deprives you of an event. But in both cases, that's the payoff. The payoff is that now you get to see slow violence. And it's not that I don't think that that's important, but I guess I want to shift the emphasis a bit. So I do talk about slow violence a bit, particularly in the COVID chapter, which also gets a bunch of play of Puar. Because I can't believe these numbers, right? Like they're talking about 30% of people with COVID getting long COVID. They're talking about 10% of that 30% never being able to go back, ever. And the current recorded numbers are 65 million. So they think it's more like 4 times that. Such that they're already seeing labor shortages. And we have no plan. There is no break glass plan for what happens if, and this is like, because I've been doing modeling stuff too. Like, I don't think it's unrealistic to say that life expectancy will drop into the 50s in my lifetime as an average. And I think work expectancy will drop into the 40s and 50s and on. And for me, that's a palliative crisis that politics has no language for in the West. In fact, in the West, the way that we kept from having a language for it is we adopted the Philippines, right? We import Southeast Asians and South Asians to do all our care work for us so that we can hope to not have to confront the fact that so many of us need care. And we that prevents us from telling ourselves other stories like, well, I accepted this job a million miles from my family because it's a good job and the money will be good. So the loss of Polina will be okay. Right? The loss of kinship will be okay. And the way that we tell ourselves that is, well, I got good health insurance. Like that's not dying, right? That's just like a place to die. So yeah, so I want to, I don't know. I think I want to push them a little further than I think they're going right now, but maybe they're already there. The person I think I'd probably be closest to, Dean Spade's book on mutual aid is amazing. Because so much of it is about the mutual aid of care labor, like emotional labor. And I think that's kind of where I'm trying to go with it. And to stop seeing that again, it's like critically, we all know that doctors all the time dismiss nurses because they do care labor, right? It's not considered real labor. But I think it's amazing it's how often intellectuals do that. How often intellectuals dismiss care labor as not real critique. And also not real politics. And even more so, like the first time I gave this talk, they're like, well, that's pretty nihilistic. And I was like, really? Because I think nihilistic is like abandoning people to die by themselves and hoping that we'll invent some value in the future that will bring them back to life and screw their heads on robots. Like that's nihilistic. To never die again, right? As opposed to think about dying as like probably the most intimate thing we'll ever share with other people. And not to be afraid of it, but also to literally prepare ourselves for it and not prepare ourselves for it off screen, behind the curtain, somewhere else, at church, but like what the hell else should scholarship be doing? Yeah. Oh, I don't know who's first. Yeah, you were first.
Cheers, thanks for your powerful talk. I was reminded of one short story that Eduardo once wrote about one young doctor in Buenos Aires was offering care to one terminal patient. That old lady was constantly asking him to measure her pressure.
Yeah.
And after she died, she was starting to ask, she's so persistent to ask to measure her pressure every single hour, and he came to the conclusion that he was missing the human touch. So when you're talking about what should be done and how to redefine ourselves as citizens, I think it's important to be able to imagine how to offer care and to be gentle to others, to learn this, but also how to express that we need care.
Yeah.
How to show weakness in society that is built on success, on permanent idea of able bodies and lives. So how to add also this moment?
So I think that that relates to this question of trust. So I think it's amazing how often trust is actually the central problem. Like when we say, well, no one believes in climate change, and they're like, well, we'll make better data. It's a trust problem, it's not a data problem. When we say that like people need more mental health care on campus, the reality is it's almost never a care problem, it's often a trust problem. People are afraid to share they need care. So I think that's absolutely it. What's important to me is that we often put the obligation or the burden of trust on those people who need the care. We often don't think about the labor that needs to be done reparatively of earning the trust back from those we have violated, right? For those which we've put in a position to feel vulnerable, right? And so I think, I remember this happening a lot during the green COVID years, where he was blaming Pacific Islanders for spread, and like for 2 minutes, he was like, oh well, they've been through so much, but they're gonna have to do the work, right? Like basically, it was on, right, Pacific Islanders and Hawaiians to trust science, even though science has given them no reason, and trust the state, even though the state has given them absolutely no reason to trust them, right? Like that wasn't happening, right? No effort was made to repair. And now lots of public health people did that work, right? They were on the ground trying to earn that trust. And I think the ones who did succeeded, but more vaccines was seen as the solution to that, as opposed to more credible vaccines. And I think, in a place where they literally faked cholera so that they could starve Hawaiians, it's hard to imagine. I can't imagine why you wouldn't trust that this is a disease that's going to affect you. And so I don't know. I think it's an issue of trust. The other thing I'll say is, because you said hands, I have this idea. I want to try to think about theory as hands, in a different genealogy of the evolution of hands. So the evolution of hands that we get from angles is that hands were developed for labor. And it's actually the development of hands for labor, the ability to grasp tools, that made humans rational. It's what set us free from the apes. It's his story of Darwin. And I like to think that hands are the shape that they are because they fit on foreheads, and they fit on faces, and they fit on arms, and they fit on other hands. And I want to think about how differently, that those are kind of the parallels in philosophy. A vision of philosophy in which philosophy is for doing things that accumulate and solve problems, problem of logic, the problem of reason, versus a theory of hands of philosophy, that philosophy is for hot foreheads and people who want their temperature taken because they just want to be touched. And how would we think about that doing is really important to me. I haven't read your short story, but I'm going to track it down. But it's the reason why I love The Plague. In Camus' The Plague, the most beautiful moment in the entire novel, the doctor, he had a chance to leave because he was a doctor, right? So he could have gotten out, and they shut down the city. And he stays to help people. But that's still when he thinks maybe he could help people. It's halfway, 2/3 of the way through the novel, and it's clear he has no cure. He has no way to treat them. All he can do is keep them comfortable. And he and his friend, who's the journalist, swim out into the ocean, and they realize they've actually swam out beyond the perimeter. And if they kept swimming, they could leave the town. And at that moment of that realization, they swim back. And like for me, like that's always like since I first read that novel, my freshman year of college, like for me, that's like ethics. Right? Ethics is that moment where you could escape. And you don't. And you don't because you have the magical cure, because you finally caught the monkey, because the cute girl who was your ex-wife is now going to marry you again under Dustin Hoffman. Like, that's not why you go back. You go back because being with them is more important than being with them. Right? It's a collectivity, it's a solidarity, which for me was always a radically different vision of existentialism from even most of how Sartre thought about existentialism. Right? Where that moment of affirmation isn't preceded by the self phenomenologically, it's the other way around, right? That moment of solidarity makes itself. He becomes that doctor again when he swims back. So yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, Kathy, and then
Thanks for your talk, Jared. It's fascinating. And I'd like to hear more about the relationship between two concepts that you kind of did a bit of a drive-by on, and I want to see how you would, as Mike would say, stage an encounter between them, and they are plasticity and wonder.
Yeah.
And so when you talked about wonder, it was, if I recall right, in the context of Socrates and dreaming.
Yeah.
But that could, of course, more broadly be found in Plato throughout. So that's what Arendt said about Plato, right? It was all about cultivating wonder.
yeah, lots of begins wonder.
And so there's wonder, and then there's plasticity and this capacity to be formed.
Yeah.
And then the porosity of things. So how do you connect those?
I'm bringing plasticity into it more because I'm trying to rework ascesis. So Foucault did a lot of work to rework ascesis, and particularly in the second volume of the History of Sexuality, he talks a lot about ascesis not happening alone because it happens with the master. It can happen in a kind of dyad. But it still kind of is about a making of the self, right? It's a care of the self. Whereas what's interesting for me about plasticity is that Malibu's point about everything from intelligence to reason to connection is that inside-outside distinction doesn't hold, right? The natured nature and naturing nature is going on all the time. And so you don't need a master, you need the world, right? So what I want to try to work through, and the reason why I want to hold on to wonder, and Jane makes some appearances for sure, is that I want a dialogue of ascesis that could happen with non-human animals, non-animate things, yourself as not yourself, as people who have to experience themselves often disassociated from themselves. And to not see that as an obligation, but as a lure, right? So I think what wonder does is that wonder, and this is Hadot's point about Epicureanism in particular, more so than Stoicism, is that Epicureanism is about cultivating the ability to feel the pleasure of wonder in the world, to find it and see it in other places, right? That you didn't see it before. Because Stoicism can lead into a kind of asceticism, right? To stay away from our emotions, stay away from the world, see death as sort of like something that's outside the world. Whereas Epicureanism more explicitly wanted to think about precisely our attraction to the world, our joy that we found in it. And so, yeah, but I want to hold those two things in tension a bit too, plasticity and wonder, because sometimes wonder is creepy. The other book that I was taking a break from writing, this is too depressing. Like wonder is also the reason why people dig around in people's brains, and wonder is also the reason why people try to train dolphins to, blow stuff up. And wonder can also be why you just don't even care that World War II is going on. You just want to see what a self-sustaining chain reaction looks like. And so wonder can't be this recurrently beneficent thing, which I think it is almost always in the Greek tradition, right? There's no darkness. And I think the point of plasticity is that like that can turn on a dime, right? This moment for which wonder was this thing that was inspirational can also become inspirational for something quite horrible. The thing I'd say about plasticity is, because I kind of try to read Malibu with the eye, is that in Malibu, the other importance of plasticity is not just the forming and being formed, it's the plastique, it's the explosive character too, that everything can just go up in a minute. And therefore, following Bataille, the only thing that's sovereign is chance. The only thing that's sovereign is the explosion, death. And so if we put those two things together, then we're tended to wonder, we want to cultivate wonder, we want to cultivate affectivity and the ability to be affected, but we also want to realize that like wonder can go horribly wrong. Because I do, I couldn't read the critique portion, but one of the things that Foucault reminds us in the very last Heterosexuality Volume 4 is he shows us how quickly these Hellenistic ideas became Christian ideas. So in particular, the idea of monogamy and avoiding sex before marriage, which was supposed to be a spiritual exercise in the Greek tradition, suddenly became this sort of like moralistic, puritanical exercise in the first century of Christianity. But it just turned like that. But his point, I think, is that there was already a bit of that in the Greek thought, right? The way in which they were trying to deprive themselves of pleasure as a means of control, right? To think about this lack of relationality as a way of showing their mastery was rife for being captured by Christianity. And so I don't want to have a kind of Hellenistic romanticism either, which is why I'm pushing back both against the concept of self, which I think that they fall too easily into, or at least our translations and readings of fall too easily into, and then also there's some fun. Because I want those to be, I want it all to be dangerous. I don't want any of it to be easy. I don't know. Does that help at all? Okay. Yeah. In the back and then. Yeah. No, you.
Okay, yeah, so I was gonna kind of build up that maybe that community point, so I'm kind of interested in the point of itself you were talking about. And so I was thinking, yeah, especially like with the Epicureans and Stoics, there's this like, it's very, almost very individualist.
Yeah.
That same thing, it's almost like this almost pre-contractual for engagement. And it's like, yeah, like you were saying, mastery. There's a British philosopher, Raji, that was like talking about like trying to, in his history of Greek philosophy itself, though, he is trying to like uncover, okay, but there is an embedded self, like, the good life is at the end, you had people in your family, and you will never appreciate what you've been able to do, and it's very different maybe than like an early modern kind of concept of a love. Yeah. Individuals, so that's what I was kind of.
Yeah, I'm also like, I don't know, after reading Udo, I just like went ahead and bit the bullet, and I've been reading Epicurus and like really like going through Epictetus as well. I really, let's be honest, like these are tortured texts, right? These are texts that were stolen, burned, recovered, bits and pieces. I'm not as confident that conception of self is their conception of self. So I am also trying to look for slippages where the self-mastery is a practice, it's not a teleology, right? Like it's what Terence Deacon calls teleo-searching, right? It's like a vague sort of intuition that they want a more mastered self. And then I want to think about the other side too, which is kind of on the side of responsibility, which is like, don't we also want techniques for sometimes like pulling ourselves together just for a minute for somebody else, right? Where if the self is a process, it's a practice, if it takes work, if it isn't something that pre-existed those practices, then getting good at it sometimes is as important as letting it go, right? There are moments where we need to be able to kind of, again, because if we couldn't hold on to ourselves as a self, maybe we couldn't have that distance with that person we don't know who needs that bit of gentleness. So I don't want to like go, you know what I mean? Like, and that's actually because I'm also trying to hold intention, particularly a kind of Nishitani version and Nagarjuna version of Buddhism, where I like a lot of the impulses and the ways in which practice and meditation is thought of, but I don't want a metaphysics that's about evacuating connection. I want a metaphysics that's exactly the inverse, that's about proliferating connection and proliferating, connections to suffering, right? Not letting them go. But at the same time, borrowing from them, think about how dangerous too autonomous a self can be, right? Right. So like again, like I'm doing a lot of.
Yeah. Well, you brought up lovingness too.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a point where you do need some sort of constant self.
Yeah. But one that's in debt, right? Like that's the importance of totality and infinity, is that the self is in debt to the other. Ontology didn't come before the other, right? And that's, this is what feminist Levinasians have said forever. It's like, you mean your mom, right? Like, You mean everyone who took care of you and wiped your butt? You mean like everyone who like made sure you didn't get hit by a car and everyone who taught you something? And like, it's not like, one of my problems with Levinas is it's this very formalistic sort of almost like pre-Kantian encounter that happens. And then like everything snaps into place and we're phenomenological subjects all of a sudden. And we just have this ethical debt we make payments on. As opposed to like, you know, we didn't become selves until we were like 15, you know, like it's a long, slow process of congealing and cooling, and a lot of people play a part for good and bad. So I want to spread out, right, the relations that make that moment, but I also want to hold on to why Levinas thought that, right? He didn't want that lonely Heideggerian notion of being towards death, where one is being towards death, right? He wanted to think about the dying and violence and all that stuff. I don't know if that helps. Sarah.
Last question. Okay, this is from Kenneth on
Oh.
Zoom.
Awesome.
What is the soundtrack for Palliative Theory? A nice final concluding question.
Lately, it's been this John Coltrane song, In a Sentimental Mood, which I think it's like one of the most beautiful songs in the world. I almost played before. I had this moment where I was going to play a song. I was either going to play In a Sentimental Mood or Helplessly Hoping. And the reason why is because they're two of the most beautiful songs in the world, and they're not going to save the world. And like for me, actually, music is like one of the best examples, like of my argument in a nutshell, which is like the fact that we lock a language of value for talking about beauty anymore, unless it does something. Like my most traumatic experience as a kid, because like I was always the kid who didn't want people to know that I was the kid who didn't have money. And I showed up at a birthday party of a kid who had a lot of money, and I convinced my mom to spend more money than we had on a spaceship because I just thought it was really cool. The kid picked it up and he said, he like shook it. He's like, "What does this even do?" You just like throw it in. Because like he'd gotten a bunch of like remote control things, and we turned out to be really good friends. But like I was wounded forever, so wounded that I'm 45 years old. And I'm still telling the story. But I feel like that's what we do with so many things now. Like this is a really interesting idea, but like, what does it do? Like what can it accomplish? What can it save? What can it fix? You know, what political bargain can it make? What bipartisan bill can it get passed? Is it policy relevant? Does it improve the economy of Hawaii? Does it make it easier to get a job? Does it? No, I'm serious, right? Like it's this litany of things. All I want to be is like, shut up and listen to some Coltrane and tell me that we should get rid of that stuff because it can't pass legislation. And then get back to me. So a lot of music. But, yeah, David Crosby, rest in peace.
All right, with that, thank you everyone in person. Our next colloquia will be in 2 weeks. We've had a change of plans today. So it's actually going to be a workshop and panel for graduate students and members of our faculty on publishing and other professional development. So faculty members, if you're interested in participating, please come talk to me because I will need faculty members for it. But we're very excited to see you in 2 weeks. Thank you again, Jared. For our Instagram. So Jared,
Oh.
you might see a photo with everyone. I've been asked to take a photo.
Yeah, sure.
So if y'all are
Dressed like a lumberjack.
Thank you, have you all. I think I'm just supposed to take.
I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think I just.
You're just taking a picture of me on the wall. Oh,
I think I'm supposed to be like your person. I don't know. I don't exactly know. I was just supposed to take a photo.
I'm pretending to talk to you right now about something useful and important that can get my attention.
Lovely. Thank you all.